皆さんこんばんは。じゃあ、ビジネス本日もよろしくお願いします。6月23日木曜日、米国株見ながらね、FF11 やっていきたいと思います。今日はですね、まあ、昨日、なんすかね、まあ、開始から結構上がっていったんですけど、まあ、後半、まあ、危険にかけて、まあ、ほぼほぼ、開始の値とほぼ同じだって、上昇のね、勢いがなくなってきたのかなと思ってね。で、本日に至るんですけど、で、今日もね、プレネから上がっていったんですけどね。で、マーケット始まると、ちょっとね、まあ、売りと買いが激しくぶつかって、まあ、横展開になっている状態ですね。まあ、基本的にプラスに転じてるんですけど、まあ、これはどっちかに傾くかですよね。意外と、買いが多くてね、なかなか思いっきり下がっていかないっすね。むしろ、上昇が結構、なんか絶好調でね。自分結構、やばいなぁなんか思いつつあるんだけど。今日も上ね、結構ね、勢いよく上がっていってるんですよね。で、自分も結構マイナスにいっちゃったんですよね。なんか円高にもなってるんですよね。まあちょっと上がっていきそうですけど、134円になっちゃってね。で、ベアを買ってるんですけど、ソックスが意外と絶好調でね。TMV が、俺、虎の子の TMV がマイナスにいっちゃってるってね。今、うん、金利がね、結構下がってるんですよね。他の値も結構ね、ベアはちょっと今苦戦してますね。もう TMV がちょっと、まあ、TMV ね、もう一回一旦ね、売っちゃって、もう一回買い直しちゃった方がいいかもしれないけど、また来月ね、上がり始めるかなと思うんですけどね。やっぱやっぱね、なんだろう。後半とは15日後の月末あたりはね、あんまりね、振るわないね、TMV ね。まあでも今日一旦下げてまた上がっていくかなと思っている。101か。下がったな、これ。もう利益あるこれ。もうないよね、ほぼほぼ。売っちゃって。もう買うしかないっていう感じだな、俺は。これは。この値で買い進めていいのかなっていう。いやー、下がったね。 しょうがねえんだけどな。下がるしかないんだよな。こんな感じだよな。今が低っぽいんだけどな。25日あたり低なんだよな。ちょっと難品した方がいいなっていう感じかな。また、金利上がるでしょ。普通に。いやいやいやいや、上がってくるか。パウエルさん話し始めたら、なんかね、また、出ますね。ツイッターかな、パウエルさん。ちょっと待って。見つけた。
寝るだけでいいんだ。
睡眠時間が肌ケア時
わ
洗濯槽にも潜んでいた匂い、カビをかくまう
みんな
菌の
見てんのか。
隠れ家。これじゃ洗っても洗っても臭くなるだけ。そうなる前に新アタックゼロだろ。洗濯槽まで。
洗濯槽の菌の隠れ家まで新アタックゼロ。スペシャルウィーク
にゃにゃ
で宿ホテルの半額。それがじゃらんスペシャルウィーク。
お得な旅はじゃらんスペシャルウィーク。リクルート。
largely not settled. For one thing, it is clear that our economy has become more concentrated, largely due to lower levels of formation of smaller businesses. That has happened. It is not at all clear that there's a connection between a more concentrated economy and, for example, inflation. And of course, matters of corporate concentration are outside the jurisdiction of the Fed. Those are for the competition authorities and really not for us to discuss. In terms of why prices are going up, I think a lot of it has been a lot of the places where prices have gone up quite a bit have been situations where supply is constrained and demand is very strong. And so take cars, for example. Demand for cars went up a great deal during the pandemic. People wanted to ride in cars rather than public transportation, and they wanted to move to the suburbs and things like that. Rates were low. The economy was stronger than people expected. But the companies couldn't really make more cars because they couldn't raise their output because of the lack of semiconductors. So when demand hits fixed supply, what happens is prices go up and margins went up. And so I think as the economy returns to normal, we would expect those profit margins to return to more normal levels.
前テレビやった時なんかあんまテレビショーっていうかテレビのニュースのやつとあんま喋らなかったんだけど。
And yet they managed to net an additional $500 million quarterly profits.
I apologize. I'm having a hard time hearing your words. I'm sorry.
Okay. The example that I gave of Tyson Foods and the fact that they said that their prices were rising due to labor and freight costs, yet they managed to net an additional $500 million in quarterly profits. How do you explain that?
I'm not familiar with their profit and loss statement, but I will say, and again, there may be particular industries where there are competition issues. I don't know that. It's really not our focus or our authority.
Well, do you have the opportunity to look at rising costs and identify corporations where they are gaining substantial profits, yet they keep raising their prices? Do you have a way of examining that?
I think we can see that, but I think, our job is to keep, maximum employment and price stability. So we're not in the business of regulating individual companies or determining whether their actions, for example, are anti-competitive or that sort of thing. That's more for elected people and also for the competition authorities. So we do look at that. But again, I think a great deal of the price increases that you saw were a matter of supply being unable to meet demand, and the result was prices moving up. In many cases, that was the story.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, who is the ranking member of the committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would, on this debate about corporate profits, I would commend to the committee Secretary Yellen's statement where she rejects the idea of corporate greed is to blame for inflation, and I concur. We have a complex set of issues. The fiscal house was certainly different than monetary policy, and the extraordinary nature of the partisan American Rescue Plan, $2 trillion injected into a recovering economy, and Democrat policies to keep people out of the workforce for longer than the rest of the Western world also contributed to inflation. So that is a political debate here on Capitol Hill, Chairman Powell, and that is on the political side. What I want to ask you about are the policy tools that you are using. Now, certainly you, as chair of the Fed and the Open Markets Committee, took extraordinary measures in the midst of the pandemic to ensure that we didn't have further contagion, and including extraordinary lending facilities, purchasing securities, keeping the federal funds rate at zero. These were the right tools at the right time. On the fiscal side, you had to partner with bipartisan bills to keep our economy afloat during government shutdowns. But like all the good firefighting measures, we should put them away when times change. I want to talk to you as you put these measures away, how you expect the economy to respond. So let's start here. What is your level of commitment to fight inflation?
Well, so it's unconditional, our commitment is, and the reason is that we need to, in a particular situation, we have a labor market that's sort of unsustainably hot, and we're very far from our inflation target. We really need to restore price stability, get inflation back down to 2%, because without that, we're not going to be able to have a sustained period of maximum employment, where the benefits are spread very widely and where people's wages aren't being eaten up by inflation. Really, it's something that we need to do, we must do, in order to have that kind of a labor market. We'll need to do it.
So as you pull back these emergency measures from COVID, and you normalize rates to what they look like sort of in the long run, how do you expect the economy to respond?
So when we raise interest rates, and also to a lesser extent when the balance sheet shrinks, what happens is rates go up across the economy and financial conditions generally tighten. And you can think of it as in interest-sensitive spending is an important place that'll be affected, and that's things like automobiles and other durable goods. If rates are higher, then demand for cars will moderate, will decline a bit. The second channel would be asset prices generally. We don't target any particular asset prices, but higher interest rates tend to bring them down broadly. That tends to mean a little bit less spending out of because people's wealth has perhaps declined a little bit. And the third channel can be the exchange rate, where that also has disinflation effects. So overall, we have these effects on the economy. Our intent, of course, is to bring inflation down to 2% while preserving a strong labor market. As I've mentioned, that has become significantly more challenging with the events of the past few months, particularly the war, which which is driving gas prices up and raising energy prices and also food prices and disrupting supply chains further.
So at the same time, you have a massive balance sheet. First begin with mortgage-backed securities. As we have a roll-off of the Fed's balance sheet of mortgage-backed securities, what are expectations for how that affects housing?
So I think what will affect housing is the rate. The housing industry and market are slowing down from a very, very hot pace, and that's
家の値段につい
partially
て
because of
話
higher
してる
mortgage
な。
rates. The effects of shrinking the balance sheet will be marginal
家の
compared
値
to the
段
effects that we're
もう
seeing.
家
Expected
金
contingency
高くて
from
ね、
rates,
家全然売れてないみたいです
rising,
ね。アメリカ
rising
ね。
mortgage rates.
But what are your expectations and any further announcements? Can we expect further announcements on the assets you hold and securities you hold? Or are there going to be balance sheet announcements in the coming weeks?
No, I would say this. We have a plan. We've articulated it. The markets are forward-looking. They see it. And the markets are in a good place, I think, understanding what we're going to do. And that's we're going to be allowing these securities to mature and run off our balance sheet at a pace that we've said. And it'll be 90 or 95 billion, I guess, by September now. It's about half of that. So that's what we've done, and we expect, the idea is that that'll just be on an ongoing basis in the background. And we think the markets can handle that. Treasury issuance is way down, so we think there will be demand for these securities. The Treasury will then reissue them in whatever form they think is appropriate when it relates to Treasuries. So,
Thank you.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair, it's good to see you. And I know you'll hear a lot of probably political stuff going back and forth. But the American public is trying to understand the language of which we're talking today so that we can really understand what inflation is. Fact of the matter is, I just recently was over in Europe. There's inflation in Europe, just like there's inflation here. Although, as I talked to Christine Lagarde and others, they say the cause of the inflation may be different. So if the causes are different, they said that maybe demand here, but not a case of demand there, is to resolve inflation in Europe. For example, I was in Moldova, 30% inflation rate, gas $15 a gallon, Turkey 80% inflation rate, gas $13 a gallon, and I could name places in Europe from Europe to the United States. Is it that we had, whether it's the supply chains, the China shutdown, complete shutdown, the zero COVID policy, Russia's war in Ukraine,
中国の
COVID period.
コロナのシャットダウンは
Massive storm of everything is what contributes to inflation and causes it all over the world.
ロシアとウクライナの問題は
It's a little bit of everything, right? So if I'm talking to my constituents, trying to explain to them what inflation is and what causes it, I would not single out any one thing. I would probably have to talk about the conglomerate of things, because if you take away 2 or 3 of those things, we might not be in the situation here. All of it unprecedented, all of it really out of the control of anyone. Out of control of Democrats, out of control of Republicans, out of control of the president, out of control of other governments. Is that not correct?
コントロールできますか？
some of it is out of our control. For example, the price of oil and most of the price of food. And to your point, Europe has much more. It's much more about energy and food prices. Very difficult problems, and also they, of course, have the European
エ
Central
ネルギ
Bank
ーと
has different
食料
countries,
と
and so they
価
have
格は
to worry about the difference, the spreads
深刻な問題です
between
よっ
different
て。
countries, and that's a different challenge that we don't have here. We have the difference here for us is we actually have a very strong economy and well-recovered economy, and so more of our inflation is from demand, and we do have tools to deal with demand. That is the place where we actually can work.
なんだろう、食料価格と小麦とかはちょっと下がってるかな、あと原油もね。そこら辺なんだろう、インフレをなんかアメリカはなんか結構ね、原油下げてるんで結構すごいですね。
was what we had to do. Otherwise, we would have been in worse shape.
あんなに下がる
Not
とは思
have
わ
a
なかっ
strong economy as we have now compared to
た。
other
右肩上がりかな
countries.
と
Is
思
that
ったんです
correct?
けどね、原油持っときはね。
Yes, I would say it this way.
なんでこんな下が
Our
ってんのっ
inflation
て
is a
何も
consequence
して
of
ないの
very
に。
strong demand, in part driven by
で日本のガソリンの価格は全然まだ下がらんっていう
support
ね、
activity, in
謎
part
なん
driven
です
by
けど
we
ね。
did, but also
But that helped stabilize our economy at that time, right?
it did.
And if we did not do
that
those
is-
things, our economy may not be as strong as it is
い
right
くら
now.
円安だからって。
I think that's right.
That's
So
correct.
our
So-
economy is strong.
And let me jump to
170
something
円ぐら
else
いで
real
すよね。
quick, because the one other thing, I know you testified before the Senate yesterday, and what concerned a number of my constituents that I talked to was the question about can we resolve inflation without increasing unemployment? Because our folks are concerned about losing their jobs and not being able to, it'd be worse if they were unemployed. So my question to you is, can you speak to what the Fed has seen during the last few years with respect to the relationship between unemployment and inflation? And is it possible that we can continue to have a strong labor market while also curbing inflation?
It's certainly possible that we can, and there is a relationship between unemployment and inflation. The challenge now is that inflation is at a 4-decade high, and some of it we can deal with. Some of it is really going to be dealt with on global markets, the price of oil and that kind of thing. We can't affect those, but the challenge is we're tightening monetary policy, and that's designed to drive growth down to a level that's more sustainable and lower, give the supply side a chance to catch up, and give inflation a chance to come down and bring inflation down. That's what we're trying to do. We don't have precision tools, and we raise and lower interest rates. It affects the whole economy through many channels, and so there is a risk that unemployment would move up from what is a historically low level. Though a labor market with 4.1% or 4.3% unemployment is still a very strong labor market. Today's rate is 3.6%, and there are 2 vacancies for every unemployed person. So that's a labor market that's kind of overheated.
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Chair Powell, thank you for joining us again today. I just want to start by saying how sick and tired I am of the president's inflation blame game. One day it's Putin's fault, another it's the oil companies and the meat packers, or perhaps it's corporate greed. Now we're blaming other countries like Estonia, Turkey, Europe. I give you my avid assurance that no one in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District gives us a rip what the price of gas and groceries are in Europe. They care about what they are at the corner of Manchester Road and Weidman. No one in this administration is willing to accept responsibility for the dismal economic situation America is in today. Inflation, sir, more than tripled in 2021, from 1.4 to 7%. And from June to the end of September 2021, inflation hovered, I think, around 5.4%, and then began a steady increase until reaching an historic 8.6% that is now crippling Americans' spending power today. Chair Powell, when inflation remains steady at 5.4% during that period in 2021, what factors played into the Fed's decision to keep rates at nearly zero during each FOMC meeting in June, in July, and in September of 2021, sir?
So during the summer of 2021, just giving us hindsight, inflation was coming down month by month. If you look at monthly readings for CPI or PCE, they were coming down month on month through September. And so that I think told us that our thesis that this was going to be a passing inflation shock was at least plausible. I think that the data turned pretty hard in October and November, and we very much changed our position, and since then have tightened financial conditions quite significantly.
なんで去
So
年
it was a matter of a few
CPI 上げ
months
なか
when
っ
we
た
were
じゃあ、なんだろう。
really looking at
違
this
うよ
and
な。
thinking it's going to be passing Most macroeconomists thought that it would be a passing thing.
金利上げなかったって話。違う？なんだろう。
But we saw it move from 1.4% to 5.4%. So I don't, we did have a steady period of time. I wouldn't say that it was declining, but I'm just surprised that we weren't moving more quickly at the Fed. I mean, I want to be honest, sir, that the Fed, I think, underestimated actual inflation. What do you think you missed?
Well, we did underestimate it. With the benefit of hindsight, clearly we did. So it comes down to this judgment that we had to make. It has really nothing to do with our framework or anything like that. And every central bank had to make the same judgment, which was looking at the supply chain problems and the shock to labor force participation, millions of people out of the labor force. We had to decide whether that was going to be a lasting thing or whether it would kind of turn around quickly. We had very high levels of labor force participation. Suddenly they're much lower. The thought was people will come back as soon as COVID is over. We have these new vaccines. Every American's going to get vaccinated. We'll be done with COVID by the end of the year. So basically, these supply side issues, broadly speaking, just didn't get better. There were recurring waves, and that was the judgment we had to make. We knew it could be wrong, and I think when it started to look pretty wrong, we pivoted.
Now, President Biden continues.
7 months ago.
President Biden continues to say that a recession is not inevitable. As his government agencies, and Dems in Congress continue to spend billions and trillions of taxpayer dollars, burden businesses with costly rules and regulations, and on top of it, the president refuses to unleash American energy independence. The president's policies continue to take inflation-taming options, I think, off the table and hamstring the Fed's ability to focus on price stability. President Biden not only limits the energy production here in America and spends trillions of our taxpayers' money, but he also threatens tax increases and promises to cancel billions in debt. How can you still say, sir, that the Fed has a pathway to a soft landing for the economy?
Well, that's our intention is to achieve inflation getting back to 2%. And
with all I've laid out,
a strong labor market. I'm sorry?
With all I've laid out and the increases you're going to have to take.
So as I mentioned, I think that path has gotten more and more challenging thanks to the effects on oil prices and food prices really, and also the supply chains from the war in Ukraine. It was never going. We never said
not
it was
just the war in Ukraine, sir.
Well, it's the rise in energy prices and the rise in which has been began in the latest rise from February.
The latest rise. This has been going on for a year and a half. I appreciate the chair's indulgence. I will yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Chairman Powell.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair of the subcommittee on oversight and investigations, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, Chair Powell. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to have a few thoughts with you, share some thoughts. In February of 2021, you indicated that millions of people were out of the labor force, which is what you said today, millions. And with millions of people out of the labor force, the Biden administration and persons on my side of the aisle sought to do something about that, to help those who were unemployed. The inflation that my colleagues speak of has to do with unemployment, the help that we gave people who were unemployed at the time. Persons who are unemployed, Mr. Chair, they need help. They can't feed their families. Small businesses were screaming for help. We helped small businesses to get through a turbulent time. This was a pandemic. The vaccines had to be distributed and developed. That's a part of that inflation that they're speaking of. People needed rental assistance. People were literally going to be evicted by the millions, but for the assistance from the Biden administration and Congress. We wanted people to go to work. We provided some child care. If you want people to go to work, Schools are closed. You got to help people through these turbulent times. They never talk about what the inflationary costs that they speak of really did, how it benefited American people who were suffering. They overlooked that. They weren't going to help, and now, since they didn't help, they're going to say everything that they can to demean
なんで怒ってんの?
No, they didn't vote for it. They don't extend the hand of friendship to people in times of need. So when they don't do that, they have to find a way to denounce the help that was given. It's really shameful. It's painful, and it's sinful to hear people use a term, inflation, to indicate that people who were unemployed shouldn't have received help. The small businesses that were begging for help shouldn't have been helped. Vaccines shouldn't have been distributed. People shouldn't have gotten rental assistance. They shouldn't get child care. Now, I would respect them if they would say these things, that these are things that they opposed. But they're not going to do that. They use one word, inflation. And unfortunately, our messaging to all of the American people has been somewhat lacking. But I want the people that I serve, who pay attention to the supermarket more so than the stock market, to know that when they needed this help, we were there for them. And Mr. Powell, you indicated that there were millions of people out of work in February of last year, just prior to this help being accorded people. I welcome your commentary.
Sorry,
I welcome your commentary.
You welcome my comment. Sorry, I didn't catch the last part. So, you know, our job is maximum employment and price stability. We did what we did during the pandemic, acute phase and response, and you did what you did, and now we are where we are. And so we have a job to do, and it's very important that we do it, not least because of the people you talk about. The people you talk about are really suffering from inflation now at the grocery store, and the only way we can get back to that, get back to a place where inflation is low again, get inflation back down to 2%, and help those people, is by trying to get demand and supply back in balance.
Let me intercede and say this. You said something that I find favor with. You said, we did what we had to do. We did what we had to do. We did what we had to do. We were the adults in the room who did what had to be done. Others who declined to do can now be critical. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you, Chair Powell, for your testimony and your time here today. Financial freedom is American freedom, and frankly, Americans do not have the financial and economic freedom they need to invest in themselves, their businesses, and their families. Unfortunately, Americans are too busy making ends meet to focus on anything else. Inflation is running rampant across the United States, with consumer prices rising 8.6% in the past year, the largest price increase since 1981. From fuel to meat to housing, my constituents and all Americans are suffering at the hands of this hidden tax, except it's not so hidden anymore. It's punching Americans in the face, as my friend Mr. Style put it yesterday. So how did we get here? It's pretty simple. We gave up American energy independence. We locked down our citizens and businesses for nearly 2 years, pumped the economy with well over $5 trillion in what's called stimulus funds. And now, as we recover from the pandemic, we simply do not have the energy resources necessary to meet the increased consumer demand. There's a history of Democrat policies we can point to that put us in this position. From refusing to adopt an all-of-the-above energy strategy to recklessly passing $2 trillion in partisan spending through the American Rescue Plan, despite the fact that nearly $1 trillion of bipartisan relief was unspent. But the bottom line is we need solutions now because inflation is beating up the American people. We have to wake up and realize that we cannot continue these spend-your-way-to-prosperity policies. Everyday inflation threatens the financial security of American families, of our constituents. We need solutions. Let me just return to my point about the spending. In December 2020, we'd authorized nearly $4 trillion in bipartisan COVID relief. Yet just 3 months later, Democrats pushed through another $1.9 trillion with hardly any oversight mechanism included, even though a quarter of all COVID relief remained unspent. When President Biden was recently asked if the $1.9 trillion spending bill caused inflation, he said he didn't think the bill had even a minor impact and called the idea, quote, bizarre. Chair Powell, do you agree with the president's conclusion that the $1.9 trillion that was included in the American so-called rescue plan had not even a minor impact on the inflation we're seeing today?
I'm sorry, I wouldn't comment on what any elected official said, and it's really not up to us to score fiscal interventions.
Again, sir, if you would, respectfully, I'm not asking you to comment on what the president said. I'm asking you personally, do you believe that the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan did not even have a minor impact on the inflation we're seeing today?
We didn't comment on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We didn't comment on the CARES Act, and we won't comment on that act. And from that,
it's interesting, sir. It's interesting, sir, that you won't comment on this, but you were more than willing a year ago to talk about inflation as some transitory something that everyone has acknowledged now. It's going to be here for a while. Even though it seems like the president's Build Back Better package, this massive spending package, is dead on arrival, certain elements might not be dead. Chair Powell, do you have concerns that if Congress injects a new round of stimulus into the current economy, it could, and in fact will, add to the inflation we're seeing today?
Again, really, it's not our role to give you advice on what to do. You know, we report to Congress, not the other way around. We're sticking to our mandate and our mission, and we have a lot of work to do on that front, and not really giving you advice on what you should be doing. We take fiscal policy as something that comes to us, and we deal with it as part of everything else.
I'm very disappointed, sir. I mean, you are supposed to be in charge of the monetary policy of this country. You're now embarking on raising interest rates because that's the only tool you think you have left. This is not just a dog chasing its tail anymore, sir. This is a dog that's starting to devour its tail and its back end because of the debt that we are carrying. I want to thank you. You acknowledged we're in a bad spot. We're knowingly walking toward an even worse inflation, a recession, and God forbid, food shortages. Yet we're relying on old monetary policy tools to keep us from falling off a cliff. Sure, we can raise interest rates over and over, but the only way to curb in a disaster this bad is to raise interest rates to a catastrophic level, or as like Larry Summers suggested, we allow unemployment to go to historical highs. It's not feasible. We need to put ourselves on a strict spending diet, and we have to have strict oversight on the funds that Congress has already allocated to make sure not even one single dollar is going to waste. And we need to put control back in the hands of small businesses on Main Street. Thank you.
The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me 1 minute. It's important for the American people to understand what's being said here today, because it's being said in other rooms in this building. What the American people are seeing today is something that my Republican Party friends have given over to recently all too often, and that is rank dishonesty in the service of acquiring and retaining power. A party without any resilient or discernible principle has stumbled upon inflation. There's inflation all over the world. Germany, Japan, Africa, South America, the United Kingdom. There's inflation all over the world. But But the Republican Party has decided that inflation is Joe Biden's fault.
日本来た。日本
Or the
話した。
American Recovery Plan's fault. I've read the monetary policy report from start to finish. It gives the Russian invasion of Ukraine, supply chain bottlenecks, high fuel costs, high wage growth. It does not mention Joe Biden or the American Recovery Plan. By the way, the American Recovery Plan is a particularly rank piece of dishonesty. Set aside the fact that it cut childhood poverty in half. As Mr. Green pointed out, if that isn't something to celebrate and to perhaps have the slightest bit of humility as you attack it, I don't know what I can do for you. The American Recovery Plan, as Mr. Emmer pointed out, was about a third to a quarter of the fiscal efforts that this Congress made on a largely bipartisan effort to lift our economy to the point where it is today. The chairman said strong and well recovered. Unemployment at 3.6%. So many jobs out there that many of them are going unfilled. Did we overshoot? Maybe we did. But the American Recovery Plan, this thing that cut childhood poverty in this country in half, was about a quarter to a third of the fiscal efforts. The other money was supported by President Trump. But by the way, it's not those dollars that are still sitting in Americans' bank accounts. It's not CARES dollars. No, that was supported by the Republican Party. It's only those dollars in the American Recovery Plan that cut childhood poverty in half. Energy prices. I read the monetary policy report. I'll quote it. Because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, oil prices rose sharply. I've been around here long enough to know that putting facts and truth out is like spitting into a hurricane, but it's important for the American people to understand that. Mr. Powell, I released yesterday, I hope you got a copy, a white paper on a central bank digital currency. It's offered with humility because we have a lot of issues to work out, but I hope you've had a chance to take at least a quick look at it. I wonder if you have any reflections, or importantly, what are the next steps now that you've gotten commentary from lots of people? What's the next steps with respect to the Federal Reserve thinking about a CBDC?
So I did have it. I printed it out. I have it here. I have not had a chance to read it carefully, obviously, given all that's going on. But no, so I think generally we're doing a great deal of work. The president signed an executive order, and administration, parts of the administration are working on this. I think it's something we really need to explore as a country. It should not be a partisan thing. It's a very important potential financial innovation that will affect all Americans. And, our plan is to work on both the policy side and the technological side in coming years and come to Congress with a recommendation at some point. And we don't prejudge what that would be. I know your views are very positive on it. But I think one thing I did see in your report was the beginnings of thinking about how Congress might authorize it, and I do think that's a very, very important aspect of this. And it's great to have Congress starting to think about that.
Thank you. I think I agree with that, and I think that has bipartisan support. In my remaining minute, I'm going to ask you a question I ask you a lot, Mr. Chairman. We're obviously seeing pretty dramatic swings in the financial markets. Money is no longer free. We're seeing that in the SPAC market, the high-yield market, the equity markets, cryptocurrency. In my very short remaining time, Mr. Chairman, what should we be focused on? What is concerning you with respect to systemic risk that may develop in the face of rising rates and rising inflation?
So, basically the financial markets have been functioning well, and the banking system in particular is very strong, well capitalized, lots of liquidity, better understanding and management of its risks. The place where there have been issues, and we don't see them elevated at this point, has been illiquidity in some markets relative to where it had been historically. But
any markets in particular where you worry about illiquidity?
No, I wouldn't say that we're seeing anything that's particularly concerning. But I think sort of systematically, liquidity in the Treasury market has come down from where it was, and we've been looking for some time at ways to address that. But the markets are clearly functioning reasonably well.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair. Chairman, thank you again for being here. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal government will spend an average of $545 billion per year, which was the estimate before rates went up. And these are on interest payments on the $31 trillion of national debt. That's $545 billion is more than we spend on the Department of Veterans Affairs. So given that the national debt is currently at about 125% of GDP, with the Fed's commitment to tackle inflation, would that be limited by rising interest rates, making the servicing of the national debt even more expensive?
No, absolutely
Explain
not.
that.
No, we are, we're not in a situation where we need to consider fiscal questions like that. The U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path, meaning that debt is growing faster than the economy, but it's not in an unsustainable position. We can service our debt, and the markets understand that, and we can conduct our policy without thinking about questions of fiscal sustainability, and we do.
When your colleague, Secretary Yellen, was before this committee, she told me that federal debt, which was then about 105% of GDP, she said, quote, "That's not a number that I think is fiscally irresponsible." She also went on to say, quote, "If interest rates are zero, we could substantially have a higher debt burden." And in the formula in the following questions, she alluded to Japan and the fact that it could be about double of where we are now, meaning about $60 trillion of debt if you use her math. So do you agree with Secretary Yellen that having a national debt of over 100% of GDP is fiscally responsible, given that interest rates can change and that historically low interest rates can't always be expected?
I guess I would say it this way. We're not on a sustainable path.
リセッションのことを言ってるのは GDP
And
が
that
下がっ
means
てる。
that simply that debt's growing faster than the economy. By definition, that is unsustainable. There will be a point at which it becomes a problem of servicing the debt. We're not at that point. We're not close to that point. But we will need to get back where revenues and spending are better aligned. We don't need to pay the debt down. We just need to have the economy growing as fast or faster than the economy over a long period of time. We must do that. I wouldn't say any particular level. There is no level that I could point to where there's a lot of science behind it being a problem, but we know that the path is not sustainable.
It's interesting that you allude to growth being part of the solution. I want to talk about regulation for a minute, particularly since the Biden administration delayed oil and gas lease sales again this week due to environmental protests. So if we pursued policies to increase American energy production by approving more leases and building more pipelines to transfer that energy and cut down on regulatory barriers to make it easier for folks to produce energy and produce anything, wouldn't that make a real impact on energy prices and inflation in general without us needing to use the Fed to slow the economy with monetary policy to deal with inflation?
So these questions of the whole set of questions around energy are really questions for elected people. We don't have a mandate there. Obviously, the more supply there is, the price of something can go down. But these are trade-offs that you really have to weigh as elected officials, rather than.
I'll narrow it just for a minute. Do you believe that the vast amount of regulation is an impediment to economic growth?
I will say this: we try hard at the Fed to weigh the costs and benefits of regulation, and we do think it's important to think about it that way, because there are benefits to regulation, but there are costs, and we don't want the costs to be any higher than they need to be, because that does weigh on economic activity. Yes.
I mean, when you talk about somebody trying to buy a home and now they're questioning it because of the rise in mortgage rates, and then I hear for years that the 25% of the cost of a new home is due to regulation at some level. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is that we need to be very cautious with our regulations, because a lot of it's constraining our growth, and the growth ultimately which solves this fiscal problem. So the point I'm trying to make is that we have much better tools like deregulation, which can free up supply, rather than just monetary policy. And freeing up supply could largely solve the inflation problem for hardworking Americans and not send us into a recession. So again, I thank you for being here, and Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Iowa, Mrs. Axney, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being here. It's good to see you. We've been talking inflation, of course. We know it's hurting Iowa families and families across the country, and all of us here have an absolute responsibility to address this. And I appreciate the comments of my colleague, Representative Himes, because I've sure heard a lot of talk about how bad inflation is from my colleagues over there on the other side of the aisle, but I sure haven't heard much about the solutions that they want to provide. So I'm here to work on those solutions, and I'm glad to have you here to talk with us about that. We actually need to reduce inflation, and we've got to figure out what's driving it. So the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank just put out some research yesterday looking at how much inflation was driven by supply versus demand. What they found was that supply factors are responsible for more than half of the current level of inflation. And of course, I don't need to tell you that while prices increasing are hurting people across a heck of a lot of sectors, gas prices have really been driven up over the last few months. So, Chair Powell, on gas prices, could you talk about some of the supply constraints that have pushed gas and energy prices higher recently?
Sure. So, two big things would be just one, the price of oil.
エネルギー関係が高いってことをなんか言われてね。
And that's so we just take that price, and the second piece of it is the spread that refiners earn. So if refinery is at capacity and spreads are high, then you have a high spread there, and we know that the price of oil went up quite a bit. Started going up early in the year, and it's now come down a little bit in the last week or so. But those are the two things that have contributed to the spike in gas prices that we saw. We did see gas prices moving up, but they really moved up quite sharply beginning in the early parts of this
ちょ
year.
っとパウエルさんのところはもう今日はこの辺でいいかな。
Thank you. So you talked
結構
about
吊るし上げがあっ
a
て、
couple of pieces where folks are making more money, and you talked about the refining
レ
process
ベル
and
にな
that
りまし
crack
たね。
spread. And I think they're around.
吊るし上げされて株価が上がっていってますね。謎ですけど。下がらんね。まあ、ちょっとね、来月の CPI まで変わんねえんじゃねえかな。変に上がったり下がったりの、年利阻害なのかな。じゃあちょっと行きますかね。まあ放置だな。まあ下がってくると思うけどね。利確はまだまだ当分の先だな。 今日結構混んでんね。始まったわ。ここか。ここだな。いたわ。はいはいはい、ちょっと。早いのこいつ、足早いな、なんか。 ヨウさんがね、リレーズ忘れちゃったんだよな。バザーできたな。できた。バザーできたわ。あげれるわ。で、こう2層目で雑魚グループを3グループやれるかっすよね。ちょっと待って、もう、アイテムが。ニングがちょっとね。いや、足じゃねえんだわ。こんなとこで。ちょっとロスが。犬かい、ちょっと。犬か。犬、ともくん。ともくん、玉ねぎ。この上のやつがやれるやつだといいんだけど。あ、サボテンだ、いいじゃん。いいじゃん、ここ。よし、これ。 だから MP が。みんな全員死んだか。宝箱が、地下。あ、2個あんのね。で、オーラブストロングボックスでない。最悪。12やりに行くか。ああ、いいとこにいんね。パトリックス。来んじゃねえ、こっちに。ここ釣りにくいな。 もう2グループやって、結構時間余ったな。あと箱開けだな。あとオーラムストロングボックスだな。あ、ねえの。ちょっと待って。あったあった。1個ありましたわ。ストロングボックスでないときついな、さすがに。あ、ちょっと待って。やばい。ちょっと10人、もう一匹いたわ。失敗した、ちょっと。あと速攻でやらないとまずい。あと3分、4分か。あと1匹いた？ちょっと待って。あ、いたわ。もうね、ちょっと。よーし、これで。オファーまで来たけど。オーラム出るといいんだけど。あ、出た。やっと出た。スケルトンキー。開いた。よかった。 とりあえず達成したノルマ。ダメだ。もう死んだわ、これ。カリカリやんねえわ。結構ね、株下がってきましたね。まあいいんですけど、もうちょっと下がんねえとね、プラスになんないですよね。かなり下がんないと。何下がったんやろうって。いきなり下がりましたよね。 また演舞量やるかな、ちょっと時間あるんで。ちょっとトイレ行ってきます。まだパウエルやってる？まだパウエルさんって。全然まだパウエルやってんじゃん。全然やってんじゃん。全然やってんじゃん。
That's good, but it's not enough. We need to get inflation down because inevitably over time these expectations are going to be under pressure.
Are you able to track though the it seems like you also want to track volatility within that index of inflation expectations to see how much confidence people have that they're not going to see unexpected inflation.
Yes, we look at the distribution, and you know there's some small signs, concerning signs, and you know we just can't allow that. We really have to. Ultimately, our whole framework is about keeping inflation expectations well and truly anchored, so that inflation will return to that anchor.
And your credibility in that is autocatalytic in inflation expectations. So I think it's critical that the businesses and consumers have that confidence.
Absolutely.
Can you explain how quantitative tightening, I guess we would call it now, is going to play into that? Unrolling quantitative easing of the last 10 years?
Sure. So it's quantitative easing in reverse. So what quantitative easing does is it reduces the supply of risk-free, longer-term assets, and that tends to drive rates down as people want those. And when we loosen our balance sheet, when we shrink our balance sheet, what happens is the public will be holding more of that paper, and we won't be holding it, and that should have some upward pressure over time. Markets are forward-looking, so they're already pricing this in.
And you don't project any changes in how you're going to do QT?
So we put out a plan. We thought very carefully about it. We've announced it. Markets have seen it, and it's sort of priced in. And I think we would intend to keep to that plan. Of course, one of our principles is that we're always going to be flexible if that's warranted.
Last question for you in the final 30 seconds here, Chairman. Can you give us an update on FedNow and your plans for access both to established banks as well as to financial technology companies?
So FedNow is supposed to go live next year. We believe we're on track to do that. We've got people working really hard on it for some time. I didn't catch the last part of the question.
And how are you gonna make access available? Is it going to be just for certain types of banks? Is it going to be for financial technology companies? How are you going to adjudicate access?
So that's something we're looking at. We are, mainly it's for the broad sweep of banks, and we'll have to look at going beyond that.
Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Chairman, welcome. Glad to have you here. Would you agree that housing is a leading economic indicator on the health of the economy or on the direction the economy is going?
まあちょっと影響あるか。
Certainly an important indicator.
Because it affects so many different facets of the
ま
economy.
とめ朝出る
Because
で
it
しょう。
affects so many facets of the economy. Is that right?
まとめ明日出るでしょう。でも結構長いな。 またね、ゴブリンのとこ行きますか。ジュノの。なんで嘘。マートに話しかけるんだ。マートか。終わってなかったんだ、昨日。 この枕何？めちゃくちゃ取引してると、こいつらと。マートのゆで卵であんな風になっちゃうの？ゆで卵ってこんな風、凶暴になるの？このマートの、あれですね、フェイス欲しいですね。印象めっちゃもらった。さすがシャミ。冒険者からかっぱらってる回がありますね。なんか鬼のように下がってんな。 ビックス上がってる。ビックスちょい上がり始めたのか。あ、ちょいっと上がってきてるな。ドル円もちょっと上がりだしたな。なんでファンタストックって何？ミノールじゃないんだ。悪役なんだ、ミノールが。あら。グルームファントム。食性のエブの主役来たじゃん。 クフィも行くのね。G の6。これ天気の4。こっちか。あれお、やんのかこいつと。ただの巨人だわな。こんな強いのか。 痛えな。上がったけど、ナスダックは下がってねえんだ、そんなに。S&P は下がってねえんだ。今は高い値だな。まあ、金曜投げだな。金曜投げられて下げることを祈るしかねえな。 また樹の仮想ですね。アイドルショーにするんだ。 2万切れのみ。称号があった。ということで今日はね、この辺で終わりましょうかね。まあ結構下がったんですけどね、ナスダックのは全然下がってないんでね、むしろまだプラスなんで、まあでも結構まだ強いですね。強いなぁ。これ上がっていくね。でもさ、ここまで上がると思わなかったなぁ。ここが上がっていくか。FOMC 戻してるよなぁ。1800まで行くのかなぁ。11800。ラムライト上がってるのかな、勝手に。もう買われすぎ。もう買われてるけど。わかっかなぁ。エレビリス。買ったのに下がってんな、ほんと今日も。エレビューか、やっぱり。エレビューやばいなぁ。手放しちゃったな、普通に。ファズ上がってんだ。まあ、ちょっとね、また明日も見ていきますかね。明日は引きでぶん投げられることをちょっと期待してね、やりますか。ちょっとね、なんだ、普通に、まあ、最初よりは、若干プラスになったけど、まだまだね、まだまだ、マイナスでね、かさんでますね。ウェブスがね、結構マイナスかさんでんな。まあ、元から安かったからな、これな。ウェブルの方がな。やっぱ低くなりすぎたやつは反発で上がっていくのかな。 ということで今日はこの辺で終わりたいと思います。また明日もね、時間あったらやりたいと思います。それではおやすみなさい。では、ありがとうございました。お疲れ様です。おやすみなさい。では、ありがとうございました。